Okay, so today is June 3rd, 2014. Welcome to the Taos Institute's Relational Leading webinar series called The Conversation. Today's topic is the practices associated with relational leading. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit organization. We bring scholars and practitioners together in dialogue around social constructionist practices and theory in organizations, in educational settings, in communities, healthcare, businesses, and we really focus on the social constructionist practices that make a difference in the world. So we invite you to participate in other programs that we have, that we offer also, and visit our website at www.taosinstitute.net to learn more. I'd like to introduce our host for today, Ginny Belden-Charles. She is the director of the Taos Institute's Master's Program in Relational Leading, and she will also be joining us towards the end of the call when we get to our question and answer period of this webinar. And right now, I would like to turn it over to Ginny.
Thanks, Dawn, and hello, everyone. We'd like to welcome you to our webinar series, The Conversation, sponsored by the Taos Institute Master's Program in Relational Leading. We'll talk briefly about that program at the end of the call, but it is an online international cohort program that we will be launching soon, and we'd love to have you learn more about our program as well. We're very excited today to welcome Harleen Anderson and Joe Raelin to our webinar series. They are going to be speaking about the practices associated with relational leading. And so it's my pleasure to introduce them, and then I'll be turning it over to them. What we will be doing is hearing from them for about 30 minutes. They'll be sharing information and also in conversation with one another. And then we're going to have a question and answer series wrapping up at 11:45 Eastern Time. So Harleen Anderson is a co-founder and board member of the Taos Institute. She's also part of the Houston Galveston Institute. Harleen, maybe you're a founder of that. But I know that you are a mover and shaker in that organization, and also with Access Success International. Joe Raelin is the Asa Knowles Chair of Practice-Oriented Education at Northeastern University in Boston, and he's also a professor of management at DeMoray McKim School of Business. So I would love at this point to turn it over to Joe, who's going to get us started. And Joe, what are the practices associated with relational leading?
Well, thank you so much, and I'd like to say good morning to everybody, assuming it's morning where some of you are at. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. Before addressing that specific question about the practices, I think I should probably provide my orientation to relational leading. My version of this is referred to as a leaderful practice, which is in turn part of a broader movement called the Leadership as Practice movement. So I just wanted to say a very quick word about LAP, Leadership as Practice, and about leaderful practice, and then I'll launch into those slides on what I've identified as what I think might be the relational practices in relational leading. So as far as the Leadership as Practice movement, rather than looking for leadership in people, we look for it in everyday practice, including its moral, emotional, and its relational aspects. And the idea behind this, the wisdom behind this, is that if we can understand and reflect on our practice, then we can reconstruct it in light of our reflections and then on behalf of our mutual interests. Now, the leaderful perspective on LAP is based on, I guess, my coining of this word leaderful. And for those of you who haven't seen it, let me just ask you, those of you who are participating this morning, Have you ever been with a group that was humming along like a single unit, where everybody worked together with joy, everyone supported each other when warranted, and anyone could speak for the team whenever he or she was so moved? And what would you call that type of team? Well, a few years ago, actually more than a few years ago, I would ask about this, and people used the expression then. They would say, Joe, it's a leaderless group, leaderless. And of course, I was not comfortable with that because it's certainly not a group deprived of leadership. It's full of leadership. Everybody's participating in the leadership of the entity, and they're doing so at the same time and all together. They're doing so concurrently and collectively. So that's what led to my referring to this as leaderful practice. And in my work, I contrast it with some of the conventional practices of leadership that most of us know about, most of us grew up with. So when it comes to practices, here again, I think many of you know what the common conventional practices of management and leadership are. I think the classic five were, let's see, planning, organizing, staffing, directing, and controlling. And then visioning has also come into play. And that's clearly a top-down mentality. But if leadership is a collective practice with people engaged with one another, I like to propose that the practices are quite different. So here would be my proposal for some of the practices of relational leading, and I've divided them into these two areas, focusing on task initially, and then focusing on maintenance and socio-emotional behavior second. So if you'd look at the slide now, under scanning, I think about this as identifying resources, as you see, such as information and technology, that can contribute to new or existing programs. Scanning may also lead to simplifying a problem, or it could contribute to sense making. I also am referring to signaling, where we mobilize and catalyze the attention of other actors to a particular program. And this may also, require initiating at times, building on, modifying, or synthesizing elements of our projects or enable actions in which we are working. The third one there is constructing positions and issues to determine the boundaries of activity. Constructing may also order or reorder a particular set of events and make clear space for a sequence of events. The fourth one is weaving, creating webs of interaction across existing and new networks. It may also create a bridge between entities or between the meanings attributed to particular views or frames. The last one on this page is stabilizing. This is offering feedback to a program of action to converge activity and evaluate effectiveness. And that, in turn, could lead to structural and behavioral changes and learning. So those are, again, my nomination of some of the task practices. Now, moving to the next slide, the socio-emotional practices. These come out of, if some of you are familiar with the group process of research of Bales, these come out of those maintenance functions, and some of these also are familiar to those in action learning. So the first there would be inviting, making sure that everyone who wishes has a chance to contribute to the program, no matter their alignment, with previous agreements, and no matter the ambiguity that their contribution may bring. And then we go to unleashing, encouraging those who have held back to participate, and to participate with not only their ideas, but their energy and their humanity, without fear of repercussion. And of course, last but not least is reflecting, a pondering among self and others the meaning of past, current, and future experience in order that we may learn to meet our mutual needs and our interests more effectively. Now, if I had to say, why is it that we should consider these different forms of practices, I probably couldn't say it any better than having already seen in advance Harleen's slides. So this is a perfect entree or segue to Harleen. This is Harleen Anderson.
Hi, Joe. Thank you. I would like to reiterate what I heard is your caveat about what we're proposing and what the series is proposing is on the backdrop of conventional leadership practices and the way that people think about leadership as learning a particular set of repeatable skills and techniques and developing internalized characteristics. So in a way, what we're proposing is kind of like the salmon trying to swim upstream. So just a couple of comments. Like Joe and others in this series, my bias is that leadership is based on a set of assumptions from social construction and postmodern philosophies. And a central theme running through these two is the notion of dialogue. And my notion of dialogue draws heavily from Bakhtini's idea that we're dialogical beings. So from his philosophical viewpoint, everything to some extent is dialogical. In what I call collaborative dialogue leading, the intent is to maximize the opportunity, the potential for transforming dialogue with self and others, whether in talk or out loud or whether in expressions that are silent or spoken. So this shift is really critical because it's the background on which relational leadership is performed. And I think this is partly why it is difficult for some to learn to be collaborative and engage others collaboratively, because I personally, from my experience, don't think you can do it without making a rethinking shift. I'm not saying the shift in thinking goes beforehand, because I do think that quote-unquote philosophy and practice, or theory and practice, should go hand in hand, and something that we're considering and reflecting on simultaneously. Implied in this is that leading is not a static activity, but a dynamic, developing, emerging, and evolving activity, again, toward meaning making, toward knowledge creating, toward thought of endpoints, as well as those that are not yet determined or imagined. So a leader, in my perspective, does not direct or try to manage a relationship or a conversation, but invites engagement in particular kinds of relationships and conversations by a way of being or becoming. Sometimes I'm tempted to use the word facilitate, that the leader facilitates, but that word doesn't quite capture it for me, and as of this moment I do not have another word that captures it better. What I do think about, however, is what I call a philosophical stance, a stance that flows from the set of assumptions associated with social construction and postmodern philosophies and the notion of dialogue that runs through them. So let me talk just a little bit about the philosophical stance and its relationship to setting the stage or scene for engaging others in collaborative dialogue and relational conversations and processes, as well as to continuing to invite and nurture the engagement. And I really want to highlight that when I say setting the scene or setting the stage, it's not that you do something and that sets it, but that you must continually be nurturing it as you go along and being able to respond to what the occasion calls for. So another way of saying it is that requires being prepared for and being ready to respond for what the circumstances demand as the relationship and the conversations unfold and advance. So let me return to the importance of reconsidering the way we think about ourselves, the people we work with, and what we do together, which I again call the philosophical stance. For me, the stance is a posture, an attitude, and a tone that reflects a leader's way of being and becoming in relationship and conversation with ourselves and with others, including a way of thinking, talking, acting, and responding with them. And I've italicized the word with because that's the most important word, I think. In other words, being with, doing with, thinking with another person rather than thinking about them, thinking for them, talking to them, talking at them. I include being and becoming because I think it is a way of being, while at the same time it's not a static way of being. It's a way of being that is becoming as you move along with the others in the relationship and the conversation. So again, it's an emergent process that's unique to those particular moments, those particular circumstances. And it's not referring to a technique or a method that's duplicated across situations, as I mentioned earlier. So in action, the philosophical stance flows from the set of assumptions that I mentioned earlier. And the engagement and participation of members of an organization is what I call being in a mutual or a shared inquiry process. In other words, an in there together activity, an in there together process where you're focusing on puzzling about, talking about the issues at hand, whether that's a particular task to be accomplished, a project in motion, a goal that you're working toward, a particular problem or dilemma. A main feature of the ability is to engage and participate, and a main feature of the ability to engage or participate in mutual or shared inquiry is what I think of as willingness. A willingness to believe that each person brings the leader and the membership a gift, and that the gift is that person's contribution, and that what he or she has to say is worthy of listening to and hearing. I would also like to highlight hearing. By hearing, I mean understanding. That we can listen very carefully, we can listen very attentively, but are you hearing, are you understanding as best we can understand another what it is that they're hoping for you to understand? It also involves a willingness to believe that each person brings again, their own understanding and their own interpretation of what we, as the quote-unquote called leader, or the other members of the organization are offering. So you want to be, or we want to be careful and cautious not to assume that another person is hearing or understanding what it is that we hope that they will. It's in this back and forth process of trying to hear each other, of trying to understand each other, that is the critical part of dialogue. This also requires a willingness to be curious, which means a willingness to let go of judgments about another person's value in the organization or the value of their contributions. Letting go of judgments requires a willingness to not categorize a person. And this can be quite challenging because we live in a world, of categorizing. For me, the risk in categorizing is generalizing. In generalizing, we risk already knowing, thus closing ourselves to the uniqueness or nuances of the other, closing ourselves to the unfamiliar and to the difference in the other. And it is, for me, in my experience, of being able to connect with, try to understand the differences that another person brings, that also is very critical to dialogue and can lead us to newness and meaning making and knowledge creating. And when I say newness, I do not mean a crisp form newness. It can be an emerging newness, it can be a partial newness, but that is in motion. Also, in terms of being curious requires speaking. I think one needs to speak to invite the other person to speak so that you can listen to and try to hear them. In speaking, I'm referring to posing questions, making comments, gesturing with our eyes and with our bodies with the intent of inviting the other person's voice. and inviting them to talk again so that you can listen. John Shotto refers to this as responsive listening, listening to understand. One of the things that happens is that when you're not listening to understand and involved in that kind of process, you, I think sometimes unwittingly, participate in filling in understanding gaps. So we offer our interpretations, our translations of what the other person says, and again miss the richness of being involved in the unfolding of their offerings. So again, I think in this back and forth process, meanings are clarified, extended, edited, again becoming new meanings, whether ever so slight, tentative, or dramatic. I think the stance, as Joe indicated, encourages less hierarchical and dualistic relational systems. For me, it encourages a sense of belonging, participating, creating, and owning, and more of a sense of competency, confidence, and community for members involved in the task at hand and in the system at large. I think that here is where Joe's approach and my approach converge. The stance invites the leadership capacity of each person, or as Joe suggests, a leaderful practice, or we might say leaderful system, a system full of leaders in which each person lives and performs as a leader. For me, this is important to keep in mind that consistent with this view, and I think also I would say this, Joe, about what you have just said, is that we're talking about a shift in not only thinking about our professional practices, but a shift in thinking about ourselves as people. So I think our comments, for me, apply to both our professional and our personal lives. Mm-hmm. So I'll pause here. I
have one. Your talk, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, your talk led to a number of thoughts and comments and questions.
Okay.
That I'd like to throw out there if we still have some time before the questions from our group.
Okay, and likewise for me regarding yours.
Okay. Well, we're supposed to be quick about this, but I'll just make one or two quick comments, and then I can ask my question. One comment, you recall one of the 5 classic functions is control. Mm-hmm. And in some respects, with the movement that we're referring to here, we're giving up control, aren't we? Because in dialogue, you have to be prepared for the dialogue leading to an outcome that none of the participants may have thought about initially, right?
I agree.
Yeah. So that sometimes is difficult. And you also even started by saying it may be very difficult for some in some cultures to engage in this way because you said we're almost swimming upstream. And my experience has been that the most difficult country that I've had to work with in terms of embracing some of these collective practices that you and I have talked about would be the United States.
I would echo that, absolutely. And I have several ideas about that, but I won't go into them at this point.
And I'll just throw out my last challenge question, okay. And then I'll let you then come back to me. The challenge question is that I know in sponsoring this leaderful culture that I've been talking about for many years now, I'm very careful about my language, and I very rarely use the word leader anymore. And I know that you were qualifying near the end there on that usage. And I'm wondering if we say the word leader, are we in some ways being inconsistent with our message here that we're very committed to a more collective practice?
I think that's a good question as well. I hear it as a comment. And I think that perhaps in our presentations today, both you and I are influenced by the title of the series in terms of relational leadership and the idea that we're supposed to be talking about leadership, leading, and leaders. In my own work, I simply talk about practices. I refer to what one might think of as clients or learners as the people that I work with, and I refer to what I do as what I do when I'm engaged with others who want me to participate with them in some helpful way. So I tend to use more everyday language and less reliance on nouns.
Mm.
You began your talk using the words reflections and reflecting.
Mm-hmm.
And for me in my work, and it sounds like in yours that that's really, really critical. I think one of the things that as practitioners, which I guess is a noun, but in our practices, or as we're practicing, what we often fail to do is take time to pause, step back,
Mm-hmm.
and carefully think about, carefully reflect on the way we think, the way we do, particularly the way we respond to others. So I think it's really important to take time to reflect. And I see the webinar series as not only sharing ideas, but I think it also invites reflection. For me in my practice, reflection can come as we're listening to another person speak. And to be able to invite the reflections in is important. In other words, for me, I think out loud talking and silent talking are both equally important, and sometimes the silent talking is the most important.
Right.
Because when we're reflecting, trying to put those thoughts into either spoken words or written words or typing them on the keyboard, that is such a dialogical, or has the potential to be such a generative dialogical process. So I like your focus on reflections.
Yeah, that could be one of the most critical skills and almost meta competences that may come out of this program. The ability to not only reflect privately as an introspection,
Mm-hmm.
but to consider that as just the first step, right, in reflection, because ultimately you want to bring out those reflections in the company of others, right? I think that's a Socratic principle, in fact. And we'd also like that reflection to be critical, right? Not only public, but critical, that we can delve into the underlying assumptions, not only that we present, but that others are presenting to us, that we feel comfortable enough to challenge what they are saying and what they are proposing.
Right.
But ultimately, I think in the work that we do, we need reflection to bring out those things that we are observing, those things that we are planning, those things that we are actually doing in practice. And that way it becomes available for learning. So I probably, even though I saved it for the end, I probably consider that maybe the most fundamental skill of all.
I think it's extremely important, and also connected to, I think, the difficulty of people within the United States being able to grasp and make sense of some of the things that we're speaking about.
Yeah.
Your use of the word critical catches my attention, because at least here in the States and in the Western world, we tend to think of critical as something negative, as finding the dysfunction or the deficit. And I like to think in terms of critical as looking into something with another person. In other words, being in this process of trying to more fully understand as best I can what the other person is saying.
Right.
I think often when we take the kind of critical position that raises question marks for me, is that we're so habituated toward trying to make sense of someone else's perspective from our own sense-making maps. And what I propose is that we have to try to understand from the other person's sense-making map. So it's that sense in which I use the word critical. How can we look into this? How can I look into the other person's map along with them? And of course, be open to their looking into my map from a critical perspective. But you're right, we have to be able to challenge ourselves and to be able to be challenged.
Harleen and
What
Joe,
you
this
say-
is Ginny, and I'm back online with you because we have so many incredible we have incredible questions coming in from the group, and I would like to throw a few out there. We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to ask you to be brief in your responses, and we'll generate some more ideas here. Actually, one of the things you were talking about, I'll throw a quick question out and then turn it over to Saliani. But one question that someone put out there is how robust or how fragile are these practices? In other words, when you're in the thick of organization life, business is gone awry, whatever, could you speak to the capacity of these kinds of practices to to hang in there in really tough times?
I think that.
Go ahead, Harleen.
You mind? Yeah, thank you. I think the practices have unlimited potential. I think that what we think of as robust or fragile is influenced by the way that we interpret or translate people, situations, etc. And if you think in terms of the practice and what I'm calling the philosophical stance as an emergent way of being and becoming, that requires you to be able to be flexible and adapt to what the circumstances or situation calls for, demands, then you're always operating on a continuum, sometimes more so, sometimes less so at either end. Joe, your thoughts, please.
Just quickly, I think these practices can become rather natural. I mean, they may seem a little imposing, but again, with such practices as reflexivity, what we've talked about as critical reflection, right? What that leads to is a meta-competence that allows you to step back and let the action flow and pay attention to it. And as Harleen said earlier, understand yourself through the perspective of the other. And if you can get into that modality, some of these practices begin to sort of make their own way. You will find that they're not as ominous as they may otherwise appear.
Joe, I appreciate that because I think sometimes people think reflection means hours and hours of journaling or meditating. All are good things, but I've seen these kinds of practices work in under 3 minutes in a business conversation, and they're powerful. So. Saliani, do you have a question to share?
Yeah, sure. There are many questions coming in, but I would to say one that I guess goes into the direction of what you guys are already talking, which is to what degree does the organizational environment condition these methods?
Well, I'll just start by saying that the culture matters a lot. But people ask me all the time, if I can name, all the leaderful organizations in the world, and I can name some, Orpheus Chamber Orchestra, for example, W.L. Gore, but it's more important that there are units in each organization that behave this way. And so you can start developing a relational and leaderful practice, in your own setting. As long as you don't have a control freak as a boss that won't even let you do that, then that goes beyond the pale. But Harleen and I are so convinced that this type of practice can lead to kind of a mutual inquiry, which in turn can lead to a whole set of very beneficial outcomes, even the bottom line type of outcome that I think for the most part, even somewhat semi-controlling managers will leave you alone to develop your own practice.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I suggest to people trying to work this way or incorporate some of these ideas and ways of practicing in their own organizations is, one, to be modest in terms of your expectations of yourself and others, and two, you have to be able to let go of it. You cannot have the intent of making a work group or an organization a leaderful group or organization. In other words, you can't have an intent that you are trying to impose on someone else. You can only speak, act, talk, respond, and reflect in ways that invite that, and that you have to be able to respond to the response back to your invitation.
And I'll just add an addendum there from what you said earlier, Harleen, to be curious.
Absolutely.
And let's hope that our bosses are also curious. Because if you're curious, then you're in a space to allow others to shape the course of history as it evolves.
Mm-hmm. Right. Another question that has been showing up in the list is this question about working with oppressed populations and how the challenge of having a really deep dialogic conversation across very different worldviews, and with some worldviews and some groups having more power and others being more oppressed. How would you speak to that?
You want to go first on this one, Harleen?
Wow, well this could be a week's conversation, which connects with the idea of power and authority, and that some of us are in positions of power authority that are given to us or deemed upon us by local cultures, whether that's the culture of an organization or community, or by broader cultural discourses. My own thought is that I have a lot of latitude in how I position myself with that so-called given power or authority. In my experience, when you begin to invite the voices of others in, you are beginning to dissolve that position for yourself and for others in the conversation who might have began in the conversation from that positioning.
And I would, I'm sorry?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, I would add to that, remember whoever asked that question, remember we were talking about critical reflection. And
Yes.
Critical reflection gets at some of these power dynamics. It's not just reflection in the sense of having an inquiry that just changes the way you look at things. You're also looking out at the world and challenging some of those worldviews. So again, the questioner might benefit from the work of Paulo Freire, for example, and his concept of conscientization. And the idea is that we become emancipatory. We begin to challenge the dominant discourses. You'd ask questions like, whose interest is being served? Whose authority or expertise is being relied upon? What is the source of the knowledge that is being presented? Why is the work being organized the way it is? So in reflective dialogue, we get to these more dynamic questions having to do with power, even beyond just the nature of the relationship between people.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a very interesting question here, which is about the role of the leader. And the participant asks, are we confusing the role of the leader from the attitude of each individual within the role? That is, a person can take a leaderful stance within the role. So what that would be different from the role of a leader?
I'm sorry, a different stance with what kind of? Say the last part of the question again, please.
A person could take a leadful stance within their own role.
Yes.
So what's the
okay.
difference from the role of the leader?
Okay, well, the word role catches my attention, and I think as practitioners, we are sometimes seduced into performing a role. And so that's why I suggest a way of being and becoming, so that you're not performing a role that has been prescribed for you by someone else or even by yourself. Each person in the organization is capable of performing are being a leaderful person. So if we move away from the dichotomy between the leader and those who are led, I think that begins to, in a way, dissolve the question. Joe?
Yes, and I think perhaps the participant, the questioner here, may be thinking of the leader in the role of being the authority or the person that has position power. And I know most organizations are organized that way, and certainly they have much to contribute. It's just that, as Harleen was suggesting, everybody can have a role that may be critical in its own way to get the work done. For example, we talk a lot about meaning making. You know, there are certain people that have a sense of the pulse of the operation, the pulse of the organization. And as long as they're not stymied, maybe they're able to kind of bring this consciousness and this sense-making to the group. And the person that does it isn't always the person in authority. It could be just someone that has had a long tenure and just has good antenna to pick up on the culture of the unit. So we have to have all these roles evolve in the shaping of the organization.
Okay, this is Jenny, and I'm going to step in now as the timekeeper of this incredible conversation. And it feels in these that we just get going, and then we have to call it to an end. But we are so excited to have both of you, Harleen and Joe. Thank you so much for being part of this. And what I'd like to do to close down is to just share a little bit about where we're going next. First of all, I think it's really interesting that we had people from 31 different countries on this call,
Wow.
which is part of the excitement of the MSc program, is that we have this possibility of bringing together people across the world for these kinds of dialogues. We had so many great questions that we were, Celiani and I were responding to online as well. These are the kinds of questions that are coming through that we are going to be exploring in this program. So we would love to have you consider us. Again, just a really quick highlight. We're a 2-year program. The degree is granted by Middlesex University in London. Our partner, the Professional Development Foundation, works with us on the program in London. We're practitioner focused. We give credit for work experience, so a lot of the kinds of questions, the practical questions you're asking is what we're diving into in this whole topic of relational leading. We are going to be, if you could move on, Joe, to the next slide, I'll just quickly say that there is a website for more information, www.relational-leading.net. And there you will find much more information about the program, ways to register, and please feel free to contact me directly on my website. My email is on the screen if you'd like more information about the program. And Joe, the last couple of, keep moving the slides forward, we are going to continue to have more webinars as part of our the conversation series. And you can see the upcoming webinars at the website that's listed on your screen. And also you will be able to hear past conversations that you weren't able to attend. And those recordings are up on the website. So please check it out. And if you just go to www.tausinstitute.net, you will find us there. We have another 2 more webinars coming up in June. On June 12th, Sheila McNamee and Kristen Bodeford, both part of the MSc program, are going to do a topic on expanding capacity through collaborative practices. And then on June 19th, we have Diana Whitney and Frank Barrett, who are going to be doing an improvisational conversation about looking at the links of appreciative inquiry and relational leading. So we're really excited about those coming up. And finally, we want to keep these conversations going, so follow us on Twitter and look for future conversations that we're going to be hosting on Twitter as well. Again, we're out of time. I just want to thank you again, Harleen and Joe, for stimulating the conversation with us. Saliani, thank you so much for your help with monitoring questions, and Dawn, thanks for your great hosting as always. We look forward to seeing you again on the conversation. Thanks everyone.
Thanks to each of you for hosting us, and thanks, Joe. It's been very inspiring.
It's been a pleasure to be with you, Harleen, and a pleasure to be with everybody this morning.
Great.
Thank you all for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Wow.
Okay, I'm signing off.